All right. I'm going to try to get through this as quickly within the time that we normally do it. But this is a little bit longer, so we may go over a little bit. So if something happens that you have to leave, tough. Stay anyway. So we got, but we're going through this. Tonight we're going to go through the crucifixion. We have gone through everything, the trials. We left off Sunday morning with the trial before Pilate. And so now we're going into the crucifixion. Now, after the scourging that Jesus received, the Gospels don't go into detail as to how bad the beating that he got was. Now, we kind of looked at it, and from what we know about scourging and how it works, how it probably was. But the Gospels don't tell us. But the book of Isaiah actually does give us some indication of how bad the beatings were. Isaiah 50 and verse 6, it says that Jesus was beaten so severely that his form did not look like that of a son of man. In other words, that of a human being. The literal translation of the verse reads, "So marred from the form of man was his aspect, that his appearance was not as that of a son of man." In other words, he was so beat up and so badly torn up that he didn't even look human. He looked like just a hunk of walking hamburger meat, basically. He was beaten and torn up so bad. People were appalled to look at him. And these people were used to it at that time. They're used to seeing stuff like that. And so Jesus was probably by this time, extremely weak just from the beating itself. Now, from the beating, we know that he went back to Pilate. Pilate said, fine. He condemned him to death and says, take him away. He washed his hands of it, and they let him off. And they take Jesus down the Via Dolorosa, which is the path of suffering, or the way of suffering, to be crucified. Now, the total distance from where Pilate was to the place where he was actually crucified, and there's some debate as to actually where Golgotha actually was, but from what they're seeing and what they believe, it was about 650 yards, or a little over, or just under half a mile. So it was just under a half a mile that Jesus had to walk from the place where he was condemned to the place where he was to be crucified. And there's narrow streets. The streets are made out of stone, cobblestone. They're not easy to walk on. Anybody ever walked on cobblestones before? They're not easy to walk on. Okay? And he's walking, the stones are uneven. It's not like they are able to pave them out and keep them real flat and everything real nice and uniform. So it's kind of a bumpy road. But he's going down this road. There's probably markets on both sides as he goes down. And he's led through the streets carrying the cross. Now, there's some debate on this as to whether he was actually carrying the full cross itself, or if he was just carrying the cross member called the patibulum. Now, in all likelihood, and it doesn't matter one way or the other whether he was carrying the full cross or not, but in all likelihood, he was probably just carrying the cross member. And the reason was because this cross member is going to weigh from about 100 to 125 pounds by itself. If he'd have been carrying the whole cross, then it would have been close to probably 300 pounds. There wouldn't have been any way that he could do it, especially in the condition that he was in. Now, there again, it goes back to whether or not the cross was the T-cross, as some people say, or if it was the traditional Latin lowercase t cross that we see and that we associate with now. There again, which one it was doesn't really matter. The end result was the same either way. Most likely, though, that it was there. And there's people that have debates on this, build whole doctrines about this, and get upset because you're not wearing the, if you're wearing a cross, or you're wearing the wrong one, that's just, it doesn't matter. Okay? But most likely it was probably the uppercase T cross, where the patibulum was placed up on top of the stipe that was there. Okay? And we're going to see that in just a minute. But irregardless of which one it was, it doesn't really matter. It has no bearing whatsoever. The end result is the same. Whether it was the traditional Latin cross that we see, or if it was the other one. It doesn't really matter. Right? So, he's carrying this, and in front of him, the Roman soldiers are carrying what they call the titulus. Now, the titulus is what actually announces what the crime that this person has been convicted of. In this particular case, it says the King of the Jews. Now, remember, we didn't talk about it, but in the Scripture, the chief priests and elders were upset about that. Because Pilate says, put on there that he's the King of the Jews. And the chief priests and elders says, no. Put on there that he claimed to be the King of the Jews. And Pilate says, I've written what I've written. And he left it that way. So, here was the titulus. It says, the King of the Jews. It was in Hebrew, in Latin, and in Greek. Now, on his way, of course, Jesus falls. And he falls a couple of times. And he gets to the point where he can't carry the cross anymore. And they don't want Jesus to die on the street. Okay? Now remember, Jesus has been beaten, doesn't even look like a human being right now. He's carrying this cross. At the very least, the cross member, the crossbar to it, and from about 100 to 125 pounds, and he's carrying this thing through the streets. And he falls. And this thing falls on him when he falls. This, in all likelihood, probably bruised his heart, which helped to contribute to his death later on. Now, in the Via Dolorosa in Rome itself, and it's quite popular in the Catholic Church, they have this thing they call the Stations of the Cross. And there are 14 stations of the cross. They go everywhere from Jesus being tried until Jesus being buried. And there's 14 stations. And every year, around this time, they go through the Via Dolorosa, and they stop at each one. There's certain prayers that they do and everything at the Stations of the Cross. So they go through the entire streets of Jerusalem, and they stop at these Stations of the Cross. And there's 9 churches along this route as well. So they go through and they do this. There is some sections there in Jerusalem that you can walk on that still actually have the same cobblestones, the same paving that they had in the time of Jesus. So I know people that have been to Jerusalem, and they say that it's just a overwhelmingly spiritual experience just to walk on the streets, the same streets that Jesus walked on. And we're talking the very same streets, the very same cobblestones that he walked on. They said to walk through that, they said it's just, it's Jerusalem is probably considered one of the holiest cities in the world. 3 major religions all coexist in this city. You have Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all coexist in the city of Jerusalem. Okay? They all claim it to be an extremely holy city. So it is one of the most holiest cities in the world is there. Now we get to the cross. We get to Golgotha. The crucifixion event is prophesied several places throughout the Old Testament. One of the most striking is recorded in Isaiah 52:13, where it says, "Behold, my servant shall deal prudently, he shall be exalted and extolled and be very high." And Jesus talks about his fulfillment of that prophecy when he said, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life." Now what he's talking about is what is recorded in Numbers 21:6-9. If you'll remember, that is God sent fiery snakes down, fiery serpents down, to attack the children of Israel because of their sin, and many of them died. Okay? When they repented of their sins, they came to Moses and repented of it. Then God told Moses to make a brass serpent and put it on a pole and hold it up. And anyone that saw the brass serpent would be healed. They wouldn't die. That's basically what this is alluding to, is that as the brass serpent was lifted by Moses and people were healed because of it, Jesus would be lifted up on the cross so that people could be healed of their sin and repent of their sin. Second Corinthians 5:21 probably emphasizes this a lot more when it says that the Father, when God, He, the Father, made Him that knew no sin, the one that knew no sin, who was Jesus, to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become righteous in God through Him. So, just think about that. The one that knew no sin. Jesus was sinless. Jesus knew no sin. Yet He became sin for us. He became all of those things for us. He became sin. He took on all of that sin for us. Now the actual location of Calvary, Golgotha, is disputed. There's a couple of places that they say that it might be. Okay? At the end of the Via Dolorosa, there's an intersection, a T intersection. If you turn left, you go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. If you turn right, it goes to Calvary. what they call Gordon's Calvary. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre has long been believed to be the traditional side of the crucifixion, and Gordon's Calvary has caves on it that are situated that look like a skull from afar off. And people believe that's where it comes in, that it is the place of the skull. So, there again, which one it is doesn't really matter. What happened there is what matters. We can dispute it, we can talk about it, and it would be nice to know, but in the end, it really doesn't make any difference. It's not where it happened, it's what happened that makes the difference, that means anything here. Okay? Now, crucifixion as a practice originated with the Persians. They're the ones that actually started crucifixion. Then they passed it down to the Carthaginians, and then the Phoenicians. Then the Romans picked it up. But the Romans perfected it. The Romans were able to make it to where you could inflict the maximum amount of pain for the longest period of time. And that's what it was all about. That's what crucifixion was about and what crucifixion meant. Yes?
The place that he was crucified, was that the place that all crucifixions, is that the place where all sentences were carried out? Or?
That's where all the crucifixions happened, yes. And it was outside of the city. And it had to be outside of the city. Roman or Jewish law would not allow it inside the city, because a person who was a criminal and was executed was considered unclean, obviously.
Well, they weren't beheaded or anything like that. They were all crucified.
Crucified, right there, yeah. And so they had to have it outside the city. Not only that, but for sanitary reasons as well. Because a lot of times after they crucified somebody, they just left them hanging there on the cross. They left them there to rot. Sometimes, as these people were almost dead or they were dying, sometimes wild animals and birds would actually come and eat them while they were still alive. So, this was not a nice form of punishment. This was not a nice form of capital punishment. It was very, very hard on them. Okay? Yeah, it was very torturous. Now, here's kind of how crucifixion worked. And we're going on the basis that this was the uppercase T cross rather than the Latin cross, the lowercase t cross. Okay? So, what they did on the crucifixion is the patibulum, the crossbar, that was taken up and it was laid down. Then the condemned person was laid down, his arms were stretched across, and then nails. They were about 7 inches long and about 3/8 of an inch in circumference. These weren't 16-penny nails. These were big nails. These were almost like railroad spikes, These were pretty big-sized nails. Yeah, they had to hold you up. And they were driven into the wrists. Now, we always see it portrayed as the palms of the hand. Wasn't the palms of the hand. Right? Now, understand, in the ancient languages, in Hebrew, Greek, all of them, hand included the wrist. So when it says that they drove nails into his hands, that included the wrists as well. So, a couple of reasons for this. Number one, the hands aren't going to support your weight. You see, your hands, when it gets to your hands, they've got bones that come up. This is not bone, that's just flesh. Okay? The bones come up, and they come up that way. All right? So if you put a nail in there, then there's nothing to hold it up except flesh and muscle. And the weight of the body is going to rip right through that. So they put it in the wrist. If they put it in the wrist, sometimes they found evidence that some of them were actually driven through the wrist bone itself. Okay? But a lot of the times, most of the times, it was driven through just below the wrist bone, where the two bones come together. Okay? And the reason that they did this is that would support the weight of the body. Two reasons. Number one, it support the weight of the body. Okay? Not a lot of blood vessels in there. There would be bleeding, but it wouldn't cause a fatal, to where you would fatally bleed out. Now over on this side, there are arteries there. That would cause you to bleed out. But over there, there's not. Okay? Also, running right down through there is the median nerves. And when they drove that, when they drove that nail in, it went through those nerves. And that would shoot pain up their arms. And as they're hanging there on that, that's going to cause even more pain on them. So the person is there, and they are on the crossbar, and then they're lifted up. The patibulum is lifted up onto the stipes. Now on the stipe, which is the part that is standing straight up, it's about 7 feet tall. There's a little seat there, but it's really not much. It's not going to help support you up in any way. Okay? But we often see Jesus' feet on this little seat thing, but you're going to see that's probably not the way that it was. They bring him up. Now they're picking this thing up while you're hanging on to it, or while you're being hung from it. You're just being lifted up with it. And they're putting it up there on top of this stipe. Now, they then nail the feet to the stipes as well. Now, the way to do that, they have to rotate the knees and the foot to get it to where it will stay up there. Okay? That's very uncomfortable. And they nail it to the stipe. All right. So the person, in order to breathe, had to push up on their feet because their arms were outstretched and they were hanging down, and it was stretched out so much that it would it kept the person from being able to breathe out. Basically, you could breathe in, but you couldn't breathe out. That's what the problem was. It was, you had inspiratory, which means that you could inhale, but there was no exhaling. In order to exhale a little bit, you had to push up on your feet to exhale. Well, now, you've got nails in your feet, these same nails in your feet that's running through the top of your feet. You ever drop something on the top of your foot? You know how hard, you know how badly that hurts? Hey? Now you got nails through there, and the only way that you can breathe out is to push up on that. And your knees are twisted and turned in such a way that it's just kind of hard to do that. So you're pushing up, and while you're pushing up with your feet, you're still trying to lean forward. So if you're going to get the good breath, you got to pull yourself back to the cross with the nails in your hands. It's very, 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 very painful. The only way that you could breathe, the breathing was very short, very shallow breaths. That's why everything that Jesus said from the cross was very short. You didn't have a lot of long, drawn-out soliloquies from Jesus, sermons from Jesus on the cross. They were very, very short. Okay? Now, remember, Jesus is probably very, very weak from the beatings and the floggings that he got.
I can imagine he's all tore up, and you got to push up to get a breath. Your skin's all ripped off.
Mm-hmm. Against a rough cross like that, with your back all torn up.
I hurt when my shirt runs against all.
Yeah. And he's very hypovolemic right now. Means he's very weak from the loss of blood. He's lost a lot of blood. It's estimated that probably by this time Jesus has lost anywhere from a third to a half of his blood volume already by now, just from the wounds he's already received. And with this loss of blood and then not being able to breathe, as time passes, the muscles, because of lack of oxygen and their fixed position on the body, would start to undergo severe cramps and spasmic contractions. Have you ever been laying somewhere and been laying in the same spot, the same position for a long time? When the first time they put stents in, they went up to the femoral artery. I'm glad now they do it through the wrist, but before they went through the femoral artery. Well, after that's over, you have to lay very, very still for several hours. Just laying there in a bed for several hours became painful. Started to cramp up some. Okay? Can you imagine being that way on a cross? Not being able to move, to adjust yourself in any way? No matter what you did, you couldn't get comfortable. There was no way to do it. And not only that, but now Jesus has got the sins of the world on his shoulders as well. And that's even more weight on him. Isaiah 59:2 says that the sins cause separation from God, that he hides his face from you so that he does not hear. The Father, God, doesn't abandon Jesus on the cross. He doesn't leave Jesus on the cross. But all the sins of the world are now upon Jesus on the cross. Okay? All the sins that ever happened, all the sins that ever would happen, are now on Jesus on the cross. Okay? And God can't really see past all that sin. That sin is there. It's fogging the view that God has of his Son. And it's separating, it's like I said, God doesn't abandon Jesus, but all that sin gives Jesus the feeling of total separation from the Father. And we're going to talk about that in just a little while. Gives him a feeling of total separation from the Father. I mean, just think about it. If you've sinned and you know you've sinned and you've done something that you know is wrong, you feel that separation from God. Well, it's not because God's left you, it's because you've left him. Because you've turned away from him. Okay? And this is all of that sin. And that's just one or two little sins that you've got. Jesus had all the sins on him. And look how far, and look what happened. And during this time, which we're going to see, and like I said, in just a minute, that time when all that sin gets that separation, it's the first time that Jesus does not address God as his Father. It's the first time. The only time he does not address him as his Father. You'll see that in just a minute. Now, death by crucifixion basically comes from slow suffocation. The shallowness of the breathing eventually causes small areas of the lungs to collapse. The decreased oxygen and increased carbon dioxide causes an acidic condition, an acidosis in the blood or in the tissues. Fluid starts to build up in the lungs. Okay? So your lungs are collapsing, and now fluid is starting to build up as well. It puts a lot of stress on your heart to where eventually your heart will give out as well. Your heart fails. Right? And now remember, Jesus has lost a lot of blood. Jesus has been through great turmoil. He's been up for over 24 hours now. He hasn't been allowed to sleep. And he's been faced with torture this entire time. He's been scourged. He's been beaten. He's been kicked on, spit on. He's had to been forced to walk through the streets carrying this cross with him. And now he's hanging there on the cross.
Brother Stewart,
Yes.
one thing you might mention too is when they had him nailed to the cross and that, when they raised that cross up, they dropped it in a hole for it to see. But
Yeah.
when that cross hit the bottom, that surely tore more on all of the
Oh, yeah.
and that
Yeah.
and everything. So that's
Yeah. It wasn't, and they weren't gentle about how they did things anyway. The process of death by crucifixion is a very long process. For someone who had not endured what Jesus endured, had not gone through all of that stuff, it may take them days to die, several days to die. And obviously it only took Jesus a matter of hours, but it took several days for these people to die. And they were just left there, hanging there. No regard for them. A doctor said that crucifixion can be summarized like this. It appears likely that the mechanism of death and crucifixion was suffocation. The chain of events which ultimately led to suffocation are as follows. With the weight of the body being supported by this sedulum, the arms were pulled forward. This caused the intercostal and pectoral muscles to be stretched. Furthermore, movement of these muscles was opposed by the weight of the body. With the muscles of respiration thus stretched, the respiratory bellows became relatively fixed. As dyspnea developed and pain in the wrists and arms increased, the victim was forced to raise the body off of the sedulum, thereby transferring the weight of the body to the feet. Respirations became easier, but with the weight of the body being exerted on the feet, pain in the feet and legs mounted. When the pain became unbearable, the victim again slumped down on the sedulum with the weight of the body pulling on the wrists and again stretching the intercostal muscles. Thus the victim alternated between lifting his body off the sedulum in order to breathe and slumping down on the sedulum to relieve pain in the feet. Eventually, he became exhausted and lapsed into unconsciousness so that he could no longer lift his body. In this position, with the respiratory muscles essentially paralyzed, the victim suffocated and died. So in other words, the person is here, and they have to alternate between pushing up on their feet so they can breathe, and then the pain in their feet became so unbearable that they had to let down, and it would press on their arms again, and that would cause them to not being able to breathe, and they would have to alternate back and forth until eventually they just got so exhausted they couldn't do anything anymore. They couldn't continue doing that. And eventually they would die.
They could have tied rope or leather or something around the yoke at the top
Uh-huh.
and come around his arms at his elbows and help support him. But if they had done that, that would have taken away some of the pain.
Yeah. They didn't want it comfortable for him.
Yeah, no.
Basically, this starts putting a strain on the heart. Now, there's some debate as to whether Jesus died from suffocation, which is a very good chance, but he also probably died also from heart failure. In other words, the pericardium around the heart, the sac around the heart, began to fill with fluid. And it became so filled with fluid that it kept the heart from beating. The heart couldn't beat anymore. And this is evidence for when they pierced his side into his heart and they said blood and water came out. That's evidence of the pericardium and heart failure from the pericardial sac being filled with fluid. Okay? So whether that was the actual cause of death, it's hard to say, but it was at least a very large contributing factor to his death. There was probably a number of things. The acidosis that built up in his tissues because of the lack of oxygen and the carbon dioxide poisoning, his lungs starting to fill with fluid to where he was basically drowning in his own bodily fluids. It's a dry drowning, they call it. This happens to people today. They have what they call a dry drowning. In other words, you drown in your own bodily fluids, and your lungs fill up with fluid. And there was, so it was probably that, the lungs filling up with fluid, the heart failure from the fluid around the heart and the pericardium, all of these things contributed to his death. There was probably a combination of all of these things. But the one thing about it is none of them were pleasant. They were all very, 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 very painful. Now, we can see that crucifixion wasn't a pleasant way to die. It wasn't an easy way to die. And Jesus didn't deserve to die that way. Jesus, who had done nothing wrong, did not deserve to die that way. So I think we can all agree that if anybody had a right to be upset about anything, Jesus did. Okay? We hear of people that get unjustly jailed. They get put in jail for a period of time, and then they're later found innocent for some reason. DNA clears them, something like that. Here was an innocent man that died a horrific death, and he was innocent of everything. So, if anyone had a right to be upset about things, it was Jesus. Yet, his message, even while he was on the cross, was a message of forgiveness. Let's look at the first words that Jesus spoke from the cross in Luke 23:34. It says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Now, Jesus is hanging between two criminals. He's being executed between two criminals, charged with a crime he didn't commit, and yet his first words on the cross, and we've already seen how difficult it is to even say anything from the cross, yet his first words from the cross were asking God to forgive those who were executing him. who were killing him. He's not mad. He's not saying, I'll get you for this. I'll get you, my pretties, and your little dogs too. He doesn't say, no, his first words, the first thing he says is forgiveness, compassion for the very ones.
Has anyone not wondered why he was on the tallest cross, the one in the middle? I mean, why was he placed in the middle? You know,
It was
significant or not?
Well, it probably has a significance, but we see that he is talking to the two of them that were there. I don't know if they actually planned it out that way at the beginning, but it worked out that way.
They were already there, the two thieves, were they not? When he
Well, they were probably there. They probably weren't there already. They probably all went up there about the same time, pretty close to it, pretty close to the same time. So, but Jesus' first words were asking forgiveness for those that hung him on a cross. In our own lives, we like to hold on to hate, to bitterness, to resentment, to get upset and plan revenge on those that have done us wrong. Yet Jesus forgave the very ones that were doing him wrong. Don't you think we should take that example and forgive others? Forgive those who we perceive that have wronged us in some way, just as Jesus forgave those that wronged him? Jesus was mocked by the soldiers, the religious leaders, and even the crowd. Even one of the two criminals mocked Jesus while he was on the cross. He said, if you're the Christ, then save yourself and us with you. He wasn't concerned whether or not Jesus was the Christ. He could care less if Jesus was the Christ. All he was concerned about was his own neck. He wanted to save his own skin. Hey, if you're the Christ, save yourself and us too. But the man on the right said, do you not fear God? He said, this man, he says, we're in the same predicament as this man is. But what we're getting, we deserve. How many times have you heard a criminal say that? He says, we're getting what we deserve. This is something that we did. We deserve what we're getting. But this man hadn't done anything wrong. He's innocent. And yet he's getting the same thing that we're getting. Then he asked Jesus to remember him when he came into his kingdom. And Jesus makes the second proclamation from the cross. He says, verily I say unto thee, today thou shalt be with me in paradise. Think about that. The first man saved because of the cross was another man on a cross. So today you're going to be with me in paradise. We live in a world today where religion tries to tell us that you've got to clean up before you can do this. You've got to clean up before you can come to church. You've got to do this. You've got to do that. You've got to show yourself worthy of salvation.
That kind of solves that question about being baptized before you're saved, doesn't it?
Yeah. So you've got to do all of this stuff before you can be saved. We have to do these things to prove ourselves worthy of the salvation that God's given us. Yet, the first person saved was a common criminal hanging on the cross. This man had no chance. He was not going to be, his life was beyond turning around now. He didn't have much life left. He was going to be dead in a few hours himself. So he had no way to do works to make himself worthy of the salvation that he received. But he said, remember me. Remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus did. Religion a lot of times has turned salvation into work. But church, we don't have to clean up before we come to church. You come to church, you get saved, then you get cleaned up. Okay? But sometimes, even when we get saved and get cleaned, we're going to get dirty again. It's going to happen. Why? Because, you know the old saying, especially down here in the South, you play around with pigs, you're going to get dirty, you're going to get muddy. All right? Well, the world is a bunch of pigs. The world is a pig pen. And when we're walking around in this pig pen of the world, we're going to get dirty. But we can receive that salvation just by asking. The word spoken to the criminal hanging on the right of Jesus offers us hope that salvation is there for the asking if we'll just turn our lives to him. We'll just say, Lord, remember me. Look at me. Now the third cry we get from the cross, not all of the Gospels, there's no one Gospel that records every one of the cries from the cross. So we're going to have to bounce back and forth on these. But the third cry from the cross is found in John 19, 26 and 27. It says, when Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing by whom he loved, he saith unto his mother, Woman, behold thy son. Then saith he to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour the disciple took her unto his own house. Jesus began his public ministry with his mother beside him at the wedding in Cana. Jesus ends his ministry and his life with his mother at the foot of his cross. The sorrow and the anguish that Mary must have been feeling at that time must have been overwhelming. She's seeing her son hang on a cross. She's seen him beaten beyond recognition. And now he's hanging there on a cross, his blood flowing from his body. Seeing his torture, his suffering, his humiliation. As parents, how many of us could stand to see that happening to one of our children? We couldn't. We'd want to run away so we didn't have to see it. It would rip our hearts out. But instead of Jesus asking sympathy from his mother and those gathered around her, he thinks of her safety in the future. He thinks of her and what she's going to be able to do. Although we have evidence that Jesus had other siblings, y'all all knew that, right? Jesus had brothers and sisters. Okay. Now, even though we have this evidence that he has other siblings, he looked to John, the beloved disciple, to take care of his mother. Now, we don't know where Joseph was at this time. It's unclear. We know he's not mentioned in any of the, basically past Jesus being 12 years old in the temple and they finding him. We don't hear much about Joseph at all. Okay? Most likely Joseph was dead by this time. By the time that Jesus was on the cross, Joseph is more likely dead. We don't know for sure, but probably that's what it is. That's why Jesus looks to John to take care of his mother. And John does it. Now, Matthew 26 and Mark 14:34, marks the fourth cry Jesus made from the cross. Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Now remember I said this is the first time that Jesus does not refer to God as his Father. He refers to him as my God. My God, my Lord, why have you forsaken me? Jesus is asking, God, why have you abandoned me? He said, until this time, you've been there with me. The whole time, you've been comforting me. You've been strengthening me. You've been lifting me up. But this time, right now, Jesus feels utterly alone. The sins of the world, past, present, future, are on his shoulders. That's why he's hanging on the cross. That's why he's there in the first place. That sin, that guilt, that shame that he feels was so great that Jesus couldn't see that God was there. Like I said, we oftentimes feel that God has abandoned us when we have sin. But let's look throughout the Bible. We often hear in the story of Genesis when Adam and Eve sinned. Y'all remember that? When Eve ate Adam out of house and home? You know? When they sinned, God still came to them in the garden looking for them. God came down looking to find Adam and Eve. It was Adam and Eve that hid from God, not God that hid from Adam and Eve. God is always there. No matter how far we get away, no matter how far and how great our sin is, God still has a plan to bring us back to him. We can still get back to him. God doesn't turn his back on us. He didn't turn his back on Adam and Eve. He came looking for them. And when we sin and we fall away, he comes looking for us. Sin may be so great that we can't see through the sin to see God. But God is always willing to look through the sin to see you, to try to find you. And he's going to come looking for you. Okay, the fifth cry from the cross. I'm going to try to get through this. We'll be a little bit past the time, but that's all right. The fifth cry from the cross comes from John 19:28. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, saith, I thirst. This is the only expression on the cross of Jesus' physical suffering. Nowhere else does it say that Jesus complained in any way about anything while he was on the cross. But now he knows everything is done. And he says, I thirst. Everything's been accomplished. Everything's been taken care of. Let's kind of look at it this way. Hot summer day, you've been out mowing the yard, working in the garden, doing all kinds of stuff, getting everything, you got the yard looking good, boy, you weed-eated, you mowed, you've trimmed around, you've sprayed Roundup where it needs to be sprayed, everything's done. Hey? And you go over and you sit on the porch with a big old glass of sweet tea, right? Or water, or soda pop, or whatever it is. Hope none of you having a beer, but anyway. Why? Because I've done my work now. I've completed my job. I've completed what I need to do. Now I'm thirsty. I want a drink. Jesus said, I thirst. I've done what I need to do. Now, Jesus is probably close to being in shock due to the loss of blood and the pain. But his thirst is not just physical. He's also thirsting in a spiritual sense as well. He's thirsting for his Father's love during this dreadful hour that his mission is nearly complete. He thirsts for the love and the salvation of his people. Jesus has fulfilled what he said he would do in John 15, 12, and 13. He said, this is my commandment, that you love one another even as I have loved you. Greater love hath no man than this, than a man lay down his life for his friends. How many of us would be willing to give up our life, not for one of our children? We'd probably all be willing to give up our life for one of our children or grandchildren. But how many of us would be willing to give up our life for a friend? Say, I'm sorry, they're not that good of a friend. You know, I don't know anybody I like that well. No, but no greater love does a man have than to give up his life for his friends. Now the sixth cry Jesus made from the cross can be found in John 19, 29 and 30. Jesus drank the vinegar that was offered to him and bowed his head and said, it is finished. Now here it says, in John it says he gave up the ghost, but there's one more scripture I want to look at first before we get to that, because they go hand in hand. The mission that Jesus had set out to accomplish was done now. His time had come. Now in Luke 23:46 it says, Jesus cried in a loud voice and said, Father, unto thy hands I commend my spirit. Now when that happened, the temple veil was torn from top to bottom. It says it was rent in two from the top to the bottom. This is significant. Does anybody know why this is significant? Huh? Well, it wasn't a small veil. That was the Holy of Holies. Behind that veil was the Holy of Holies. The only person going the Holy of Holies was the high priest. And he had to wear bells on his robes. And a rope on his ankle. As long as I heard the bell ringing, everything was okay. When the bell stopped ringing, they had to pull his body out. Because if he wasn't worthy to be in there, God would strike him dead.
Do you know any of the specifications of this veil? Anything
Of the
like
veil?
the size, the thickness, and that? Because I had heard that this thing was some 6 inches thick.
I don't know. I'd have to look it up.
From just the veil sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it's torn in two. And it's not, it's a heavy veil, yes, but it's torn in two. What this is showing us is that now God is saying, you no longer have to go to the high priest to get to the Holy of Holies. I've torn the veil so you can go into the Holy of Holies yourself. You can boldly come to the throne. You don't have to go through somebody else. The high priest no longer has to make the sacrifice. Jesus, the high priest, has already made the ultimate sacrifice for you. Matthew 27:51 says, and behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from top to bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent. In other words, there was a big earthquake that happened. Now, a lot of scholars will say that this was the earth mourning because of Jesus dying. That nature itself was mourning at the death of Jesus. Maybe so. But I like to think of it that the earthquake, because where do we picture hell? Yeah, in the middle of the earth. That's where we picture hell, is in the middle of the earth. So what I like to picture in my mind is when Jesus died, his spirit descended into hell. He kicked the gates of hell open and said, okay, Satan, give me the keys to death and the grave back. They're mine now. You used to have them. Now I'm taking them back. You see, the earthquake, because that was Jesus standing there kicking in the gates of hell. And the gates of hell flung wide open. And Satan sitting there trembling, and he's going, give me the keys. Jesus said, it is finished. What he had set out to do on earth was indeed finished. But what he started was only the beginning. It was only the beginning of the plan that God set into place from the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Church, you, me, we are whosoever. We are the whosoever. Now, the time was coming for the day was about to set, and they didn't want to keep, the Jews didn't want to keep these people on the cross, these dead people on the cross during the Sabbath and the festival day. So the Roman soldiers went and they broke the legs of the two thieves. Now, the reason they broke the legs of the thieves is because, remember, in order to breathe, you had to push yourselves up in order to be able to breathe, and then let yourself back down. So when they break the legs, you can't push yourself up. So you just hang there and suffocate. It's just a faster way, a more expedient way of letting them die. But when they get to Jesus, they see Jesus is already dead. So to make sure, they take the spear and shove it into his side. And it goes up into his heart, through a lung, into his heart, and out came blood and water, which is more support of pericarditis, of his heart being heart failure because of the fluid in his heart. So Joseph of Arimathea goes and secretly asks Pilate to get the body of Jesus, to take the body of Jesus down. Now, we don't know. It's likely that the thieves hung there. Probably they got taken down because they didn't want them hanging there during the Jewish holiday. But they went over and asked for the body of Jesus. Nobody else wanted the body of Jesus, but Joseph of Arimathea went out and said, hey, we want the body of Jesus. And Pilate said, fine, go ahead. So they take him down, and it's getting close to sunset now. It's getting close for the Sabbath to begin. So they take Jesus down from the cross, and they take him to a new tomb. It says that where nobody had ever lain before. Now, people say, well, some people say that doesn't, of course nobody has ever lain there before. It's a tomb. But that's not the way that it worked back in those times. See, space was limited. Graveyard space was limited. So a person, you didn't, and it's still this way in some parts of the world, you didn't buy a tomb. You rented one for a few years. You waited for your body to decompose, turn into bones, then somebody would go in, gather your bones up, put them in a box, and store them away somewhere with the rest of the family that has died. Okay? And then somebody else would get to use the tomb. But this was a brand new tomb. And it was close to where Jesus was crucified. So they were able to get it over there. They were able to get the body over there and lay the body out And it says that Nicodemus brought some spices and some aloes, about a pound's worth of spices and aloes to actually cover the body or fix the body and prepare it for burial. Well, they didn't have time to completely prepare the body for burial. So they just wrapped it. They put the spices and the aloes on him. They wrapped him up in a sheet. They put a napkin on his head or a cloth on his head to wrap his head up, and they laid him in the tomb. And then they left. But the high priests and the council was concerned that they were going to try to steal, because they remember what Jesus said, that he was going to rise from the dead. So they were worried that he was going to, that they were going to try to steal the body and claim that he had rose. So they put guards on the tomb. And they sealed the tomb. They put a seal on it. Now, the seal wasn't just any kind of seal. This was a Roman seal. And a Roman seal could not be broken except by authority of the Roman governor. So if anybody broke that seal, it was punishable by death. So they put this seal on it. They got the body in there, and these guards are standing around guarding the tomb where Jesus' body lays. And that's where we're going to end it tonight.